welcome. Today we have our lecturer coming from Vienna, not that far, but he just told me he was a guest in Münster and Heidelberg this week, so he's coming quite a long way to see us here. That's Dr. Börries Kuzmany. He's employed at the University of Vienna, the Department for East European History. He will tell us more about his current research in the presentation, but let me just give you a brief introduction to who he is as a historian. Well, he obtained his PhD at the University of Vienna and at the Sorbonne, and in his early stage did quite a lot of research on Brody, the city in western Ukraine, and this is how I actually got to know him through his work, through his book on Brody, which I enjoyed because I did my research on Trieste, and they were both part of the Habsburg Empire, and both enjoyed many political privileges, and hence had a particular kind of cosmopolitan cultural diversity in the city. So this all led into him and his work now, maybe almost a decade ago. When did that book? Yeah. But since then, his career even flourished even more because he obtained the ERC project, and he was the primary principal investigator of that project. And I wrote down the name in order not to get mixed up. So, Non-Territorial Autonomy as Minority Protection in Europe. That's the title of his now already concluded ERC project, but he is currently pursuing new topics and, in fact, extending the argument he presented or he argues for in the original project, sort of transferring them from the Habsburg period to the interwar period. If I'm correct, you'll explain it better. But he has a whole new team of collaborators at the University of Vienna now and pursuing these more, as far as I see it, more Ukraine-focused topics. I'll give you the floor now, and you please be patient, and then we'll have some time for a discussion.
Hvala lepo I dobar dan. That's basically all I can say in Slovenian, unfortunately. So please excuse that I will talk to you in English. I actually was in Ljubljana, not in this space, but at the University of Ljubljana in January 2019, where I presented this project that Dasha just mentioned when we were just at the beginning, together with my colleague Oskar Mulej. We were sketching out what we want to do, and then now, 5-6 years later, after a multi-year fabulous working together with a team of 6 people, which was intellectually a dream. We have some outcomes, and so what I present you today is kind of a synthesis of the project and the book that came out of it. And as I'm an old-fashioned person, I brought it with me so you can have a look on it. It's in German, though. There might an English translation is on its way, but I think you will have to wait one more year or or a bit longer. So, what was the overarching idea of this project and of this book? The overarching aim was to understand non-territorial autonomy as a form of accommodating national diversity within a state in the period of nationalism. So you might rightly ask, what is non-territorial autonomy? That's not a term that we normally know or that we normally use very often. It's a group rights concept for managing national diversity within a state. This means it is not the individual who has rights or a specific sub-territory of a state that is the holder of rights and powers, but it's the group as such. What does this mean? Hence, the national group is understood as a collective entity, as a corporate entity, and everybody who belongs to the nation, wherever this person might live in the territory of the state, belongs to this group, and the group can manage the cultural affairs of its group autonomously, such, for instance, the schools, or theaters, or clubs, or museums. And as it's based not on a specific territory, but on a person's belonging, this has been labeled non-territorial autonomy. And it is basically, so it's not the territorial principle that stands in the fore, but the personality principle. Of course, you might now say that the personality principle, so the fact of belonging to a specific group, is much older in history than what I will talk about. And that's correct. If we think about the feudal period, it was much more important which status you had, and to whether you were a noble or a peasant, and you were legally dealt and treated differently. And these legal differences could also, or these groups could also have ethno-confessional aspect. If you think, for instance, on the Jewish autonomy in early modern Poland, Lithuania, or the millet system in the Ottoman Empire, but also the way the inorodzi were dealt in the Russian Empire. And of course, you could also say the entire legal relationship between the European colonizers and their colonialized populations in the colonies. It made a difference whether you were English in India or whether you were belonging to one of the Indian groups. And so in all these cases, it made a difference. It could be an advantage, or it could be a disadvantage, but it made a difference how you were legally treated according to the belonging. And that's true. These were all undoubtedly non-territorial arrangements, but my research deals with the modern concept of non-territorial autonomy, and this is based fundamentally in the idea of civic equality of all people. Civic equality does not mean that everybody was in favor of civic equality and it was not installed automatically. But everything what I'm talking about, civic equality was fundamentally present as an idea, as a background in this period. So it's therefore, and I brought this as a direct quote, I brought it in German because it's the original language where it was formulated. So modern non-territorial autonomy is not about different legal systems for different groups, but about the different application of the same legal norms according to people's belonging. You can think about it a little bit like religious belonging. You can be Protestant in Koper and in Maribor and in Ljubljana, and you would still belong to the Protestant Church of Slovenia. Yeah, so it doesn't matter where you belong, so where you live, and the state will owe you. I mean, if the state is treating you at all as a religious citizen, but for the state, you are subject to the same legal norms. Yeah. So that's the big difference, and this idea of civic equality, this is where it begins in the Habsburg Empire with the revolution of 1848, and this kind of sets the beginning of my investigation. And in the Russian Empire, it's a little bit different, because there we see the way how the imperial administration applies the personality principle is in transition between a pre-modern understanding and the age of nationalism. This is why Imperial Russia is a very interesting case. So I start my investigation with 1848, and if you want, I tell you today the story of the first 100 years in Habsburg Central Europe, in the Russian Empire. Then I make a jump to interwar East Central Europe, and a last space of investigation is European minority protection, mostly in the interwar. But of course, you could. So I stop in the end of the interwar period, but you could extend this story. The story goes on until today. I mean, Slovenia has. Slovenia, but maybe Croatia and Hungary and Serbia, they have currently non-territorial autonomy legislation implemented. And interestingly, it's also today more political scientists and legal scholars that are more interested in this topic than historians. And we see lively of course, it's not a schematic one-to-one application, but the idea is there in the way how, also outside of Europe. So for instance, how Canada treats its First Nations, or how New Zealand relates to the Maori population. Or there's also a very lively debate in Israel-Palestine on how to deal with the ethno-confessional frictions in that country. As you see from this slide, I explicitly transgress the dividing line of the First World War, and I think this is because, well, this reflects very much the methodological theoretical framework of my study, but I would say of our entire project. Because the methodological framework was the idea of traveling concepts and practices. What do I mean by that? I want to say that knowledge about theories and practices of non-territorial autonomy was received and was adapted synchronically and diachronically. So, on the one hand, people in other countries knew what was going on in another country. They read the theoretical deliberations from these countries, and they were observing political developments. So this is the synchronical part. And also diachronically, people, in particular in the interwar period, they were very well aware of what has been happening before, and who was suggesting what, and which state or which regions had implemented something. And they referred to this. And the fascinating thing from my point of view is that on its journey through European history, these traveling concepts and practices could be adapted, and actually were adapted, to very different political, social, and ideological circumstances. And detecting such intellectual references and cultural translation processes, this was one of the main research aims of our project. And indeed, the reception process, I will talk about this a bit later in my talk again, the reception processes really went in all directions. And what is very important for me to say, because this is also because I didn't think it when I was presenting this in Ljubljani in 2019, you would not have heard about this. Then I thought what happened in the Russian Empire was kind of, they looked at what is going on in Austria and then they took it over. No, they had their own column, their own thread of intellectual discourse that led to a development of non-territorial autonomy ideas. As you can see, we have a very wide geographical area, and of course we used a wide range of sources, printed and unprinted, in many languages from all parts of Europe. And archives, so archival material was more used in those cases where I looked at concrete implementations of non-territorial autonomy. So for instance, in the case of Moravia or the Ukrainian People's Republic that you mentioned, that we are extending now in a new project, or the non-territorial law and implementation in interwar Estonia. So therefore we used archival material, and then of course we used tons of printed sources, and I really think here we have a wide variety of types, ranging from actual laws, but also draft laws, discussions and minutes from parliaments, from provincial assemblies, party meetings. Then of course we have a lot of pamphlets and books and articles on how to solve the national question. And then of course newspapers are also very important. As you see, my research is located at the intersection of intellectual history and political history, and the aim was to contribute something to nationalism studies. And the study of nationalism is something that I always understand as an entangled history. So let's go and get a bit more concrete. So this was an introduction, but we are already in the midst of the topic, so it was more than an introduction. So let's first turn to the Habsburg Empire, where starting with 1848, we have a very, very lively debate on how this state should be reformed. And this debate went in all directions, from a very centralist position to federalist position. This federalism could be based on crown lands. This federalism could be based on the creation of new ethnic territories. So really the discussion went in all directions, and as you certainly have heard, they did not agree on how to reform. But I think there were two, maybe not a consensus, but two conclusions that most of these people agreed, even if they opposed the implementation. But basically everybody understood that in national issues, as a mechanic democratic voting, so majority decision versus minority decisions, would not solve anything. Because if you're a minority in a given land, you will never become a majority as you have in a normal political system where it's not based on ethnicity. So democratic majority decisions provide no answers. I think this was one conclusion. And the second was that a purely territorial reshaping of the empire could never solve everything. This does not mean that people were not asking this or demanding this, but basically they know that this will not solve things, because national or linguistic homogeneity was a chimera, and actually is a chimera in all countries, but some countries don't care so much about it. I mean, in the Habsburg Empire it was obvious. You just had to look on the map. And what is very interesting is that Austrian Social Democrats, when they started to develop their own ideas around the turn of the century, they were very, very well informed about the ongoing discussions, and they had read those works and suggestions. When three Austrian Social Democrats, one from the South Slavic section, Edwin Kristan from the Slovenian lands, he was actually the first one to propose a form of national autonomy. He was maybe least heard among those in the Austrian Social Democratic Party. Most often, this idea of national autonomy is linked with the names of Karl Renner and Otto Bauer, and I would say, in particular, the writings of Karl Renner are very interesting. Karl Renner based his idea of reforming the state on territorial and non-territorial elements. But what was very important for him is that despite there should be territorial districts, and that could be nationally or binationally, but the main idea was to rebuild the empire according to 6 national groups. So that the nationalities of the empire should become legal entities, what I said in the very beginning, so corporate bodies that should build up the state in its entirety. It was, by all means, it was a model to reorganize the state as a whole, to turn it into a nationalities federation. And I think in this respect, the Austro-Marxist way of understanding non-territorial autonomy differed very much from the Russian way, how it was conceived there. I will talk about this in a minute. There, the self-governing institutions, they should also be non-territorial, but there should be something that should be aside of the state. So not that the nationalities would make up the imperial state, but there would be the imperial state, and there would be, if you wish, national minorities having their own institutions, but they would not form and build up the state. Until now, I only talk about ideas, and now I would like to link these developments in intellectual history with political practices. And of course, if you want to make this link, you can never say, okay, I see this idea and I look to a one-to-one implementation of Kristan's idea or of Renner's idea or whoever. But you have to look in the way in which non-territorial arrangements were actually implemented in legislations. And after the turn of the century, we see national compromises in four regions, in 4 provinces of the Habsburg Empire. It starts in Moravia in 1905. Then we have Bukovina, the new provincial constitution of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and then in 1914 in Galicia, not the ideal time to start a new thing in July 1914, but still it was legally, it was implemented. In all these national compromises, we find elements of group rights in the electoral law to the provincial diet, and also in the procedures of the provincial diet, so how they functioned. And of course, there were differences in all these cases, because we had different power relations in Moravia than in Galicia, and in Bukovina also the national setup and the percentages were different. So there were many different there were many different nuances to how these compromises looked like, but they all followed the same logic. And I think there were two things they all had in common. Everywhere they introduced universal suffrage, but not equal. Yeah, so everybody could vote, but they continued to vote according to estate. So if you were a noble, if you were a taxpayer in the city, if you were not a taxpayer. So these categories continued. But in addition to these estate categories, the electoral lists were divided according to a person's national belonging. So you could live, so a Czech and the German could live in the same house in Brno, and on the day of the election, the German inhabitant would cast his ballot in one box, and the Czech would cast it in another, because they were, although they lived in the same house, they were accorded to different electoral districts. The elected members then sat again together in the provincial diet. Yeah. So this is the first thing that they all had in common, and the second thing. All these negotiations, all these compromises, they were not about introducing total equality and democracy, love, peace, happiness. This was not the idea. But the idea was to make it a bit better, yeah, to get a better balancing of existing national and socio-economic inequalities. So it was not about giving them away, but making the system work in a better way. And I think in this regard, the political application of non-territorial arrangements differed in the Habsburg Empire from the ways implemented non-territorial arrangements, so how they were implemented in Imperial Russia. Because there, with very, very few exceptions in the elections to the Second Duma, this instrument of separating the electorate was an instrument for strengthening the Russian element in ethno-confessional heterogeneous regions of the empire. And this can be particularly well observed when the Zemstvo system was planned to be introduced also in the Western Russian governorates in the years between 1905 and 1910. There was a loud discussion on this. So the Zemstvo system is a kind of local self-administration with limited competences, introduced in the 1860s, that very much was based on the nobility. And as some of you might know, in the Western Russian lands, the nobility was mostly Polish. And so the Russian Empire did not introduce the Zemstvo system there because they didn't want the Zemstvos to be dominated by Polish nobles. And then when they decided, okay, but we still need some kind of local self-government in these areas, they introduced an electoral system that with separate curia for the Polish electorate and for the East Slavic Orthodox population. So they wanted to keep the estate system with privileging the nobility, but they gave fewer seats to the Polish votes, although economically they would have dominated this Zemstvo system. And just as I said, I showed here the two empires in their practical applications. We also find we also find developments of this concept in Russian intellectual history. Because Russia equally experienced a decades-long discussion on state reform, and there very often the state reform discussion circulated about the local commune, and so that the local commune should be the core of a reformed state. And there is one Ukrainian philosopher, Mikhailo Drahomanov, who is very interesting in this respect, because he suggested that everybody in the Russian Empire, everybody should be allowed to form local communes. Every nation should be allowed. So not only Ukrainians or Russians, but everybody should form local communes. And these communes, so he uses the Ukrainian word is hromada, the Russian word is община, and they had the right to get into a free union with other local communes, the Vilna Spilka, the Volny Soyuz. So this was his idea. And as he granted this to every minority as well, there is a double think. Because you can understand commune in a territorial way, in the sense of a municipality, but you can understand commune also non-territorially as a community. Think, for instance, of Jewish communities that can be in a city apart from the municipality. And although maybe Drahomanov was not deliberating this idea of territorial and non-territorial, but later intellectuals read Drahomanov, and it might not come to a big surprise to you that it was especially Jewish intellectuals who took up this thread, mostly Jewish socialists, who were also close to the Narodniki movement, so that later turned into the Socialist Revolutionary Party. And then we have another strand of thought, also Jewish, by Simon Dobnov, a Russian Jewish historian. And he said, well, wait, in Poland-Lithuania, in the early modern period, Jews had an autonomy that was based on the local community, and there were institutions where these local communities could meet. And Simon Dubnov suggested that of course in the early modern period this was religious and estate-oriented, but he said, okay, let's transform this into a modern national representation system. And the interesting thing is that all these intellectuals, they of course read Drahomanov, but they also read each other's. And after 1900, they also start to read the Austro-Marxists. So they first had developed their own thoughts, and when they had reached a sufficient level of intellectual soundedness and could stand alone, then they started to be interested in what was going on elsewhere. And for instance, Jewish socialists from the Jewish Socialist Workers' Party, they were on the forefront in getting the Austro-Marxists translated into Russian. Most importantly, Chaim Szydlowski and Mark Ratner. So you see here, this is the translation of Renner's book. It's written Springer because this was Renner's pseudonym, but it's Renner's book. And here in red is Mark Ratner, who wrote an introduction to that book. And this introduction is not just 2 pages, but it's a 30-page standalone article. And when Otto Bauer's book from 1907 was translated, Szydlowski wrote, I think, also 30 pages. I don't know exactly, but so these are the people who translated these ideas to the Russian ground. And these parties had these Jewish parties of various ideological background. Dubnov was a liberal. Szydlowski was a socialist, but not a Marxist. But we have Jewish Marxists in the Jewish Worker Labor Bund as well, who progressed these ideas. And these Jewish parties, they had influence on general Russian parties when it comes to the nationalities program of these parties. And indeed, by summer, before I go with the summer of 1917, so this is very important for something that I call the translatability of the idea of non-territorial autonomy. So you have the same idea, but you can you can argue it in a liberal way, you can argue it in a socialist or in a Marxist way. So, and this is very interesting. So it could be translated into different ideological settings. So not only translated literally into another language, but also in another ideological language. And indeed, by summer 1917, the entire non-Bolshevik left in the Russian Empire had non-territorial autonomy in their party program, sometimes in combination with territorial federalism, but you find it in one way or other, you find it there, and you also find it in the Liberal Cadet Party, which was the leading party in the provisional government. And the way how they suggested non-territorial autonomy was different, but in all these Russian elements, they were in these Russian proposals, they were seen as something that is along or next to the state. So they didn't want to rebuild the state in its entirety, but something minority institution alongside the state. And as I said before, I think that's the big difference. So the Austro-Marxists wanted a federated nationality state built by the nationalities. The Russian intellectuals thought of it as something to protect minorities. And what is very interesting, because if we look on what is today, the function non-territorial autonomy has today, it is always and only used as a minority protection system and not as a model for multinational states. And interestingly, if people today talk about non-territorial autonomy, they always say Austro-Marxists, Renner, Bauer, but they actually, what they suggest is much closer to Simon Dubnov and Mark Ratner and Boris Nolde. So it's kind of they cite and rely on the wrong people. That's not so untypical for traveling concepts in intellectual history. This happens quite often, so that you refer to one, but you do the other. But I found this very interesting in this case. The Russian model can also be observed, not least in the many efforts to implement this idea, this model, during the revolutionary period of 1917 and in the subsequent years. And I studied five applications in this period that stand for analytically stand for a different approach to this system. Because these were, you can imagine, in revolutionary Russia, power relations mattered very much, and national hierarchies were changing and remodeling. So in all these different regions, let me bring an example. For instance, in the Far Eastern Republic, so the territory east of the Baikal Lake Baikal to Vladivostok. So there, which was it was kind of a buffer republic between Japan and the Bolshevik states. It had a Menshevik government, but was it was increasingly Bolshevized. But they had a law on non-territorial autonomy, and they also had a law on territorial autonomy. But some, like the Buryats, they were best organized and they got territorial autonomy. Other nationalities only got non-territorial autonomy, and some nationalities didn't get anything. So here you see a hierarchy of the principle. In other regions, it was handled differently, but the idea was there, and it was. But power relation and hierarchies mattered in the trials to implement it. In the last part of my presentation, I will give some examples of countries from the interwar period to show how adaptable non-territorial autonomy was, and how well it could be translated into opposing ideological systems. It was implemented in the Ukraine, in the socialist Ukrainian People's Republic, which was a socialist but democratic state, and in the bourgeois liberal democracies of the Baltic states. But it could also be framed in an authoritarian context, either in Bolshevik, in the early Bolshevik Soviet Union, but also in the way how the far-right Sudeten German party understood it and actually suggested it in the 1930s. So the fact that concepts are translated into different ideological languages, that's not totally unnormal. Think about the notions, for instance, of republic or democracy. I think what communist Yugoslavia understood by republic and democracy differed very much from the way France used these notions. So they were using the same thing. So that happens quite often in history, that you have a term and you interpret it totally differently. The interesting thing is how you do this. And for this, I was examining 4 parameters in these 4 cases. And there I found some interesting things. So these are my 4 parameters. So I first looked on how in these ideological settings the idea of the nation and national belonging was conceptualized. Then also the fact who was entitled to speak for the nation, and not only to speak but also to represent. And as you can imagine quite easily, this was heavily ideologized. A social democrat might have a totally different understanding of the way a Sudeten German far-right politician thought. They had a totally different understanding of what is the nation, who belongs to the nation. I mean, this is maybe not so astonishing, but it was clear to see. The third parameter, so I analyzed the competences that in these 4 ideological settings the autonomous institutions should have. And here I was myself astonished, because I would have thought that this is very ideologic as well. But you see on the far right, but also on the moderate left, you see positions who want to basically include everything. So not only cultural and educational matters, but also social matters, statistics, migration, everything into these, give the competence to the autonomous bodies. And then you have liberal, but also Bolshevik saying, no, just education. So this was astonishingly less ideologized. It was rather a matter which earlier thinkers they were referring to. And the last parameter was the reference to intellectual precursors. And so when in the interwar period, they referred to earlier thinkers of this idea. And of course, this was ideologized. But the interesting thing is that they were still mentioned. And my favorite example is Max Hildebrand Böhm, who was he wasn't originally a German from the Baltics, but he was very active in the circles of the Sudeten German, was one of those Volkstum scholars, and he wrote basically, he acknowledged the intellectual conceptions of Karl Renner, said, well, this is good, this is what we should do, and then he added, if it hadn't the Marxist drawback. So the word, for those of you who know German, he writes explicitly, der marxistische Pferdefuß. So it's very, so he says, yeah, that's good, but unfortunately, they are Marxists. Yeah. So and I find these things very interesting. So it was ideologized, but not ignored. And of course, far beyond these 4 case studies, non-territorial autonomy was common knowledge among those people in interwar Europe who were interested in minority affairs. So interested diplomats, experts on international law, and activists or politicians from minorities, they were aware of both the Austrian and the Russian origins of this concept, which didn't mean that they necessarily liked it, but they knew about it. For instance, Robert Retzloff, who was a French international lawyer, he made a very good analysis of this, and then he said, oh, but don't get it wrong, such a system is a capitulation of the state. Yeah. So, but what I want to say is here that this was common knowledge to people who were interested in this. Non-territorial autonomy was also present at the Paris Peace Conference. It was mainly argued for by Jewish Zionist representatives. It had no chance to be implemented, but it was discussed. And it had no chance to be implemented because the League of Nations minority system was fundamentally based on the nation state, and the entirety minority protection treaties and regimes, they were all formulated, so the minority rights that were formulated there were formulated as individual rights and not as collective or corporative rights. However, we have the largest minority lobby group, we would say today, the largest minority organization, the European Congress of Nationalities, became the most important supporter of the idea of non-territorial autonomy. And this, not least, because in the Congress there were so many active politicians and activists from the Baltics. Yeah, Paul Szyman from Latvia, Ewald Amende from Estonia. Okay, the president of the Congress was Josip Vilfan, from a Slovene from Trieste. So, but these Baltic activists, they were in part involved in the legislation of Estonia and Latvia that had introduced non-territorial autonomy in the 1920s, and they appreciated what was going on in their home countries, and they wanted to propose this as a generous solution to the European minority project, minority protection. And overall, the European Nationalities Congress, it's also because the Nationalities Congress had a different hope or wish how the international order should be based. Whereas the League of Nations wanted or installed an international order based on nation states, the Nationalities Congress would have preferred an international order based on peoples, on nations. And with this idea behind the idea of group rights and corporative national bodies was much closer. But anyway, in this European Congress of Nationalities, in a way, my book comes full circle, because there converged the intellectual history, because these people proposed ideas that were developed earlier. There merged the political experiences of Estonian or Baltic politicians having experienced what was happening in their countries, and the personal networks that are also very important, because these people knew each other. Either they read about it, what the others wrote, or they knew each other in person. So this is where all these different threads, you could find them coming together in the Nationalities Congress. Yeah, and here I stop. I'm in the end of the interwar period, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions. Thank you.